November 10th, 1985. A hunter walks into the woods outside a small New Hampshire town. He is not looking for a body. He finds one anyway, a rusted metal barrel, half buried near the edge of a burned-down store. He pries it open. Inside, wrapped in plastic, the remains of a woman, and beside her, a small child, no names. No ID, no missing person report that matches. Just two bodies, sealed away like they were never meant to be found. Police will spend the next 4 decades trying to answer one question: who were they? 15 years later, the ground gives up a second secret. Another barrel, just 300 feet away. 2 more children inside, 4 victims, 1 killer. And a mystery that will not fully break until the year 2025, using a science that did not even exist when these bodies were buried. This is the story of how one family disappeared without a trace, and how a barrel in the woods finally spoke, 40 years too late. Before we go further, comment below and tell me which country you're watching from. And if cold cases like this one keep you up at night, hit subscribe, because this channel exists for stories exactly like this. The hunter's discovery brought New Hampshire State Police to a quiet, wooded corner of Allenstown, a town better known for its state park trails than for headlines. What they found inside that first barrel was not simple to process. The remains had been there for years, wrapped tightly, hidden with what investigators would later describe as deliberate care. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a body dumped in haste. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The woman's identity was unknown. The child beside her, estimated to be a toddler, no older than 3 or 4, was equally unidentifiable using the forensic tools available in 1985. No fingerprints on file. No dental records to cross-reference. No DNA databases. Just bones, fabric, and questions. Investigators canvassed the area. They circulated composite sketches. They cross-referenced missing persons reports from across the region, then across the country. Nothing matched. Whoever this woman was, whoever this child was, no one seemed to be looking for them. That fact alone was chilling. Somewhere, someone had made sure of it. The case went quiet. Not closed. Cold cases in small towns rarely get formally closed, but quiet. Filed away. Occasionally reopened when a new lead trickled in, only to go cold again. For 15 years, the woman and the child in the barrel remained exactly what the killer intended them to be. Unknown. But the woods were not finished revealing what they held. To understand who ended up in those barrels, the story has to rewind, back before 1985, back before New Hampshire even entered the picture. In the late 1970s, a man moved through the country using a rotating set of names. To some, he was Bob Evans. To others, different aliases entirely. He rarely stayed anywhere long. He worked odd jobs. He formed relationships with women who had children, and slowly, methodically, folded those families into his own shifting identity. The children who traveled with him were not enrolled in school under consistent names. No pediatrician tracked their growth. No dentist filled a cavity and logged a record that police could later search. They existed in the spaces between paperwork, visible to neighbors and visible to any system that might one day help identify them. This wasn't neglect. This was design. A man who erases the evidence of a family before the family disappears is not improvising. He is planning for a day when someone might come looking. Records, pieced together only decades later through genetic genealogy, suggest this family unit moved through several states in the years before 1985, a mother, 2 young daughters. And later, evidence would point to a 3rd child, even younger, who belonged to this same man by blood. At some point between 1978 and 1981, all of them vanished from public life entirely. No one reported them missing. No one came looking. The system built to catch cases like this simply had nothing to catch. It would take the invention of an entirely new forensic science, one that did not exist yet in any lab, in any country, before anyone would even know their names. For now, they were only bones and barrels, buried in a state none of them had any known connection to. Back in the 1980s and into the 1990s, New Hampshire investigators worked the only way they could, the old way. Phone calls, physical case files, composite sketches distributed to newspapers and police bulletins across state lines. At least 10 possible identities were floated and ruled out over the years. Families who had lost a mother, lost a daughter would occasionally reach out, hoping, and then be told, not a match. Detectives assigned to the case cycled through it across careers. Some retired without ever seeing it solved. The file sat in evidence storage, occasionally pulled out, dusted off, reread, as if rereading it hard enough might reveal something new. It didn't. The frustration wasn't just professional. For the officers closest to the case, it became personal. A woman and children with no names, buried in their jurisdiction, deserved better than an unsolved file gathering dust. But 1980s and 1990s forensic science had limits. Without a national DNA database, without genetic genealogy, without the tools that wouldn't exist for another 20 years, there was only so far physical evidence could take an investigation. The case did what cold cases do. It waited. And then, in the year 2000, 15 years after that first barrel was pulled from the ground, the woods delivered another blow. A search of the area, prompted by renewed interest in the unsolved case, led investigators to a second barrel. It was found just 300 feet from where the first had been discovered 15 years earlier. Inside, the remains of 2 more young girls, 4 victims now, all found within the same small patch of New Hampshire woods, all still unidentified. The scale of what investigators were looking at began to shift. This was not an isolated tragedy. This was, very likely, an entire family, hidden together, buried together, forgotten together. The proximity of the 2 barrels raised an unavoidable question. Had the person responsible simply returned to the same spot years apart? Did they consider these woods safe, familiar, a place they trusted no one would ever look twice? Whatever the answer, one thing was now certain. This was not a single act of violence. This was sustained, repeated, and deliberate. The case, which had struggled for identification even with 1 victim, now carried the weight of 4. And still, in the year 2000, the tools to identify them with certainty simply did not exist yet. The barrels had given up their contents. They had not yet given up their names. Years later, once genetic genealogy finally connected names to these remains, investigators and journalists were able to piece together fragments of who this family had been before they vanished. The mother among them had 2 daughters from different relationships, meaning this was a blended family, one built and rebuilt before it was ultimately destroyed. The older girl was estimated to be around 9 years old at the time of her death. The younger, closer to 2, they had, by all available reconstruction, lived a transient life. Motels, temporary addresses, a pattern consistent with the movements of the man who kept them close. Photographs recovered later showed an ordinary-looking family. Nothing about their outward appearance suggested the danger closing in around them. There was also a 3rd child, not the daughter of this mother, but of the man himself, born to a different woman years earlier. That woman, too, would eventually be linked to Rasmussen's pattern of disappearance, though her remains have never been found. What emerges from the fragments is a picture of a family caught inside the orbit of a man who used charm, instability, and constant relocation to isolate the people around him from anyone who might notice they were gone. Neighbors, if they existed at all, knew this family briefly, and then not at all. No sustained community ties, no school records spanning years, no paper trail linking one location to the next. This is what made the case so difficult for so long. Not a lack of evidence in the ground, but a total absence of evidence anywhere else. A family engineered to be forgettable, moving through a country that had no system in place yet to catch families like this before they disappeared for good. By the time anyone began asking the right questions, the answers had already been buried in the woods of a state most of them had probably never planned to see. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, the Bear Brook case became something close to local legend. Longtime residents of Allenstown knew the story. The barrels in the woods, the family no one could name. New Hampshire State Police kept the file technically open, but active leads had all but dried up. For the investigators who had spent years on this case, the emotional toll was real. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from knowing with certainty that someone out there could identify these victims. A relative, a former neighbor, someone who once knew this family, and yet having no way to reach them. The case sat in a strange limbo, too significant to close, too stagnant to solve. What the investigation needed wasn't more legwork. Investigators had already done exhaustive legwork for decades. What it needed was a scientific leap, a tool that didn't yet exist, that would let them work backward from DNA itself rather than forward from a missing persons report. That leap was coming. It just wasn't here yet. In 2017, everything changed, not because of a new witness or confession, but because of a shift in forensic science itself. Genetic genealogy, the practice of using DNA profiles to build out family trees, Then cross-referencing those trees against public genealogy databases had begun quietly transforming cold case investigations across the United States. It didn't require a suspect to already be in a criminal database. It only required that someone, somewhere related to the suspect, had uploaded their own DNA for entirely unrelated reasons. Curiosity about ancestry, family history research, anything. Applied to the Bear Brook case, this technique did something 40 years of traditional police work could not. It connected the DNA recovered from the barrels to a living genetic network. From there, investigators were able to trace backward through family branches, until one name emerged with disturbing clarity: Terry Peder Rasmussen, a man who had used multiple aliases throughout his life. A man with a documented history of women and children who came into his orbit and vanished from it. For the first time in over 3 decades, the Bear Brook case had a name attached to it. Not one of the victims, the man responsible. It was a turning point, but not yet an ending. Knowing who did this was only half the puzzle. The victims, the woman, the children in those barrels, still didn't have names of their own. That would take 2 more years of painstaking genealogical work. Terry Peder Rasmussen was, by every account, pieced together after his identification. A man who treated identity as disposable. Born in 1943, he spent decades moving through the country under a rotating set of aliases. Bob Evans, among the most used. He formed relationships with women, often those with young children already, and folded himself into their lives with practiced ease. And then, methodically, those families would disappear from public record, one by one, over years, across state lines. In 1981, Rasmussen left New Hampshire with a girlfriend named Denise Bowden. She was never seen again. He took her young daughter with him to California, where, years later in 1986, he abandoned the child. That abandonment was the one crime that finally caught up with him in a courtroom, resulting in a child abandonment conviction. He served time. He was paroled in 1990, and then he vanished again, a fugitive for over a decade, living under yet another assumed identity. In 2002, in California, Rasmussen murdered a girlfriend named Jun. This time, the evidence held. He was convicted of her murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2010. At the time of his death, Rasmussen had no idea, or perhaps every idea, that decades later, science would trace a direct line from the barrels in a New Hampshire forest back to his own DNA. He died without ever being formally charged with the Bear Brook murders. He died, in the eyes of the legal system, having answered for only one of what investigators now believe were at least 5, possibly more, victims. The chilling detail that would only emerge years after his death. One of the children in those barrels wasn't just a victim he had taken in, she was his own daughter. With Rasmussen identified as the man responsible, investigators turned the same genetic genealogy techniques toward the victims themselves. Genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, already known for her work on other major cold cases, joined the effort. Alongside volunteer investigator Becky Heath, piece by piece, DNA fragments were matched against family trees built from public genealogy records. In 2019, the results came together. The woman in the first barrel was identified as Marlace Elizabeth Honeychurch. The 2 older children were her daughters, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters, from different biological fathers. The family had last been seen in California in November 1978. For the first time since 1985, 3 of the 4 Bear Brook victims had their names back. It was a monumental breakthrough, 34 years in the making, but it wasn't the end of the story. One victim remained unidentified. A young girl, estimated to be around 3 years old, who investigators had taken to calling the middle child. Her DNA didn't match the Honeychurch family in the same way. She was, it turned out, only half related to her presumed sisters. She was Rasmussen's biological daughter. But her mother's identity, and her own name, remained a mystery for 6 more years. The middle child's case sat as the last open thread of Bear Brook for years after. 2019, updated forensic testing in 2024, revealed something investigators hadn't previously accounted for. Her ancestry profile was fully European, a detail that had shifted the direction of the genealogical search. The New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit partnered with the DNA Doe Project, an organization dedicated specifically to identifying unnamed remains through volunteer-driven genetic genealogy. And using the refined DNA profile, researchers rebuilt the family tree from scratch. The trail led to a name, Rea Rasmussen. Born in 1976 in Orange County, California, Terry Rasmussen's own daughter, from a relationship with a woman named Pepper Reed. The identification was confirmed in early September 2025. New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella announced the news publicly, closing a chapter that had weighed on the state and on investigators personally for 40 years. With Rea Rasmussen's identification, all 4 victims now have their names back, Formella said in the announcement. It was a moment of resolution, but a complicated one. This wasn't a stranger's child caught in a killer's path. This was his own daughter, likely killed by her own father, discarded in the same woods, in the same manner, as the family he'd built around her. 40 years after a hunter found the first barrel, the last name had finally been written down, but one more question remained unanswered. Rea's mother, Pepper Reed, born in 1952 in Texas, has not been seen since the late 1970s. Investigators now believe she, too, was likely a victim of Terry Rasmussen, making her a probable 5th casualty in a case that has already claimed 4 confirmed lives. Her remains have never been recovered. For Reed's family, the identification of her daughter brought a strange, painful kind of partial closure, confirmation of what likely happened to Rea, but still no answers about what happened to Pepper herself. Family members have publicly stated she is deeply missed decades later, her fate still unresolved. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office has stated that the search for answers about Pepper Reed continues. Genetic genealogy, the same tool that finally named Rea after 40 years, remains the best hope for locating her mother, if her remains are ever found at all. Bear Brook, in other words, may not be fully closed. Somewhere, there may be one more site, one more set of remains, waiting on the right DNA match to bring a name back to the surface. The Bear Brook case is now regarded as one of the defining examples of what genetic genealogy can accomplish, a case that sat cold for decades, immovable under every traditional method of investigation, until an entirely new science caught up to it. It reshaped how cold case units across the country approach unidentified remains. Cases once considered permanently unsolvable are now being reopened. Remains once filed away as Jane Doe or Baby Doe are being resubmitted for genealogical testing, all because Bear Brook proved it could work for the investigators, who carried this file across their careers, some retiring before ever seeing it solved. The eventual identification of all 4 victims offered a form of validation. The persistence had not been wasted. The names had been there all along, waiting for the technology to catch up. The hunter who found that first barrel in 1985 could not have known what he'd stumbled onto, or how long it would take for the full truth to surface. 4 decades. 2 barrels. 4 names. One killer who died in prison never knowing, or perhaps never caring, that his crimes would eventually be seen in full. The barrel in the woods had waited 40 years to speak. In 2025, it finally finished its sentence. All 4 Bear Brook victims now have their names back. Marlise, Marie, Sarah, Rea, but justice, in the way most of us imagine it, never came. Their killer died in prison years before anyone connected him to this case at all. What remains is the woods, the memory, and one more name still missing, Pepper Reed. If this story affected you, subscribe for more solved cold cases like this one, and let me know in the comments which case you think we should cover next. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds a body. No one can name. For 40 years, that silence sat over a small stretch of New Hampshire woods. Not the silence of a place forgotten, the opposite, in fact. Bear Brook State Park stayed open. Hikers walked its trails. Families had picnics within a few hundred feet of where 2 barrels had once been pulled from the earth. Life continued directly on top of the mystery, but for the people who couldn't stop thinking about it, investigators, genealogists, a small community of true crime researchers who followed the case for decades, that silence was never comfortable. It was a wound that refused to close, precisely because it had no name attached to help it heal. When Rea Rasmussen was finally identified in September 2025, something shifted that went beyond just solving a case. It closed a specific kind of loop that very few cold cases ever get to close completely. All 4 victims, named, confirmed, accounted for. Compare that to most unsolved cases in America. The National Missing and Unidentified Person System currently holds tens of thousands of unidentified remains, people who died without anyone ever connecting their bones back to their names. Most of those cases will never see a headline. Most families will spend the rest of their lives without an answer. Bear Brook is the exception that proves what's now possible. What makes this case particularly significant for the field of forensic science is the timeline itself. In 1985, when the first barrel was discovered, the very idea of identifying someone through a DNA sample cross-referenced against a public genealogy website didn't exist, not as science fiction, not as a theory, not in any lab anywhere in the world. The technology these investigators eventually used to crack the case wouldn't be invented for another 3 decades. That means the answer to this case was, quite literally, unreachable for most of the time it sat open. Detectives working the file in 1990 or 1995 or even 2010 were not failing due to lack of effort. They were working a case that could not be solved with the tools available to them, no matter how skilled or determined they were. It's a sobering thought for true crime audiences, who often expect investigations to hinge on a single missed clue or an overlooked witness. Sometimes the missing piece isn't a person, it's an entire branch of science that hasn't been born yet. The success of Bear Brook has already had ripple effects. Cold case units across multiple states have pointed to this investigation as a model, proof that genetic genealogy isn't a one-time miracle, but a repeatable method that can be applied methodically to backlogs of unidentified remains sitting in evidence storage and medical examiner offices nationwide for the DNA Doe Project, specifically the volunteer organization that helped crack the final piece of this case, Bear. Brook stands as one of their most publicized successes. Their work, largely done by unpaid genealogists piecing together family trees from public records, represents a quiet revolution in how missing and unidentified persons cases get solved. Not through big-budget forensic labs alone, but through patient, methodical genealogical research. The same kind of research amateur genealogists do every day, trying to trace their own family history, repurposed to bring the dead their names back. And yet, for all the technological triumph, what lingers most about Bear Brook isn't the science. It's the human core of the story. A father who erased his family from public records so thoroughly that authorities spent 40 years unable to find anyone looking for them. A mother, Pepper Reed, still missing, still unaccounted for, her family left holding a different, unfinished kind of grief. A toddler, killed by her own father, buried in a barrel a few hundred feet from where her half-sisters would eventually be found. The case forces an uncomfortable question that true crime audiences often circle back to. How many families like this one are still out there, undiscovered, waiting on a piece of technology that hasn't been invented yet? How many barrels, unopened, sit in unmarked ground across the country right now? Bear Brook doesn't answer that question. It simply proves that, given enough time and the right scientific leap, even the most carefully erased family can eventually be found and named. 40 years after Hunter walked into those woods expecting nothing, the case is finally closed for 4 people who never should have been forgotten in the first place.